Ade chuds, George Demientieff Hollis Ege, Dengad this do, and I'm singing here before the mountain of our soul. Dengad, Dinavit, Denaze, Degalai Ka'a, Denali. These are just a handful of names that have long signified this place, each describing in its own distinct dialect of Athabascan the tall one, the high one, the large one, and in the Koyakan dialect, Denali, the great one. At 20,320 feet, Denali carves out the northern sky as the tallest mountain in North America. In a 1905 account of Athabascan oral history, the story of the creation of Denali and the one second in height to it, Sultana, begins like many stories of old. It was into such a time that the youngest of 8 children was born to a Koyakan Athabascan woman, Sintana, Jenny Bosco, herself a child bride, and Irish-born father Arthur Harper, twice her age. It was 1892. Having seen her 7 children leave the land to be educated outside, Jenny separated from her prospector husband and kept her 8th and youngest, Walter Harper, with her to learn the traditional ways of her people. For his first 16 years, to the happiness of his mother, Walter would come to trap, hunt, fish like those before him, speaking only his Koyakan dialect of Athabascan. Walter would not only walk in the world of his ancestors, but also the culture that came in waves to the land, that which his own father was a part of. At 16 years, the young Walter Harper and his mother moved from their Tanana home, and Walter enrolled in St. Mark's Mission in Nenana and learned his English. It wasn't long before that missionary explorer, Archdeacon Hudson Stuck, first noticed the capacities of the 16-year-old as a handler of sled dogs and a river boatsman. Stuck took him as his protege. Walter traveled with Stuck to the many villages he served and acted as his interpreter, both in language and in culture. The Archdeacon's regard for Walter was great. By the time Walter was 21, the friendship between the two was sure, and it was a practical matter of course that Walter would join Stuck in his monumental and rather outrageous plan to ascend the beacon of North America, Denali. It was 1913, and at 50 years old, Hudson Stuck was thin, not in the best of health, and by some accounts a frail man. And at 6 foot and 21 years of age, Walter was strong and ready for the task, though neither had done any climbing before. After months-long preparations, the team of 6, that would be known as the Stuck-Karstens Expedition, left Nenana by dog team. They were Walter Harper, 21, Hudson Stuck, 50, Harry Karstens, 35, Robert Tatum, 22, Esaias George, 17, and John Fredson, 18. Though they would not join in the climbing party, Esaias, the youngest, would return 150 miles to Nenana. Johnny would remain at the base camp to care for the supplies and the dogs. Hard-working young men who surely had their share in the carrying of provisions that amounted to 1.5 tons in a series of camps that would support the crew as they climbed the mountain. How they must have looked with interest on the scientific instruments brought with them. wondered at how the boiling temperature of Mercury would tell them of the actual height of the mountain. How they must have been taken in by the recollections of the older men as they recounted events that the present events elicited. Hard-working young men who surely had their share in the carrying of provisions. How those young Athabascan men must have looked to Walter as an example to them as they trekked into the mountain lands, the foothill mountains of Denali. Perhaps they discussed late at night those old Athabascan stories pertaining to mountains, stories of mountain people, stories of whole herds of caribou disappearing into rock, symbolic language that made speaking among the natural forces of the mountains safer, stories of little people. Walter was surely a source of these stories, or, moreover, a reminder of the respect needed in the presence of mountains. It was into this storied world the crew made their way to the 7,000-foot base camp. The value of this trek would not be lost on the climbers. The climb was long, and they each knew their own suffering, not the least of which was the cold, poor health, and thin air. What can be taken from such physical feats? What views they took in of each their own character must match a mountain itself. Of the last steps to the summit, Stuck records. But still there stretched ahead of us, and perhaps 100 feet above us, another small ridge with a north and south pair of little haycock summits. This was the real top of Denali. With keen excitement we pushed on. Walter, who had been in the lead all day, was the first to scramble up. A native Alaskan. He is the first human being to set foot upon the top of Alaska's great mountain, and he had well earned the lifelong distinction. With a mere turn of their heads, Walter and the others could take in a staggering view. Again, Stuck records. To the right hand, the glittering, tiny threads of streams draining the mountain range into the Chalitna and Susitna rivers, and so to Cook Inlet and the Pacific Ocean spread themselves out. To the left, the Kantishna and the Nenana drained the range into the Yukon and Bering Sea. The men took scientific readings, measured the mercurial barometer, then took down their tents, and using a pole from their tent, fashioned a flag. And Stuck says, Walter thrust it into the snow so firmly at a blow that it could not be withdrawn again, and then we gathered about it and said the Te Deum. Stuck wrote, Only those who have for long years cherished a great and almost inordinate desire, and have had that desire gratified to the limit of their expectation, can enter into the deep thankfulness and content that filled the heart upon the descent of this mountain. There was no pride of conquest, no trace of that exaltation of victory some enjoy upon the first ascent of a lofty peak, no gloating over good fortune that had hoisted us a few hundred feet higher than others who had struggled and been discomfited. Rather was the feeling that a privileged communion with the high places of the earth had been granted. That not only had we been permitted to lift up eager eyes to these summits, secret and solitary since the world began, but to enter boldly upon them, to take place, as it were, domestically in their hitherto sealed chambers, to inhabit them, and to cast our eyes down from them, seeing all things as they spread out from the windows of heaven itself. Into this strong yet serene emotion, into this reverent elevation of spirit, came with a shock a recollection of some recent reading. O wisdom of man and the apparatus of the sciences, the little columns of mercury that sling up and down, the vacuum boxes that expand and contract, the hammer that chips the highest rocks, the compass that takes the bearings of glaciers and ridge, all the equipage of hypsometry and geology and geodesy, how pitifully feeble and childish it seems to cope with the majesty of the mountains. Take them all together, haul them up the steep, and as they lie there, read, recorded, and done for, which shall be more adequate to the whole of the scene, their records, or that simple, ancient hymn, "We praise thee, O God, heaven and earth are full of the majesty of thy glory"? As for Walter Harper, his life ended in tragedy just 5 years later. In his short 26 years of life, Walter Harper became a practical icon of his time, with all the complexities of a modern Alaska Native youth in a century of change.